I'd like to start by going back to your first recollection of having met Walter Hardwick.
Well, as far as I can remember, and I thought about it the other day, Walter had just come to UBC. He had not yet finished his PhD, and his interest in urban affairs, of course, was our common interest. It must have been in the middle 60s. And Lou Robinson put us together, of course. Lou was the man who brought Walter back, and Lou knew my history. In fact, Lou was a very important part of my original start in urban issues, and Walter was the next one. So it was somewhere in the middle 60s, although my dates are slightly hazy. It was certainly, as Walter came back to teach, that we began to be really interested in each other's interests in the city.
And at the time you were teaching in the planning department?
Oh yes, yes, I've been here for a long time.
And how was it that you ended up in Vancouver at the planning department?
Because they offered me a job at UBC.
Okay, well, we won't go down that road then.
Well, you can, public property, but the answer is yes. I came to UBC to teach, and Larry McKenzie was a wonderful guide in those days when he was president. So I owe it a great deal to him.
Now, in the early times when you first met Walter, what projects did you collaborate on in the earliest times?
Well, obviously, it rotated around Vancouver and its expansion and development in the 60s, and its early start with what's called the planning department, because until about the, well, let's see, 1959, there was no such thing in this city. The history of planning is actually quite fascinating. It goes back to the Town Planning Commission, which launched the first zoning bylaw in 26-27 with the help of Bartholomew. And his notion was a plan, e.g. a document, to be managed by the Town Planning Commission, which had at the beginning one and then ultimately two staff people. And they're wonderful people. Sandy Walker was the Secretary General of the Commission for, I don't know, 15 years. And I served on the Commission for almost 10 years. So in a sense, it was around the changing circumstances, namely there was now going to be a full-time planning department in those days under Sutton Brown, who ultimately became Bête Noire. But it was issues dealing with the planning of the city of Vancouver. I can't remember now what aspect. Obviously, it soon became the central issue was transportation.
Now, Bartholomew's Plan was based on a concentric ring model for zoning in the city.
Well, all right. I mean, there are two plans. Bartholomew was here twice. Bartholomew was here in 26, 27, and then again in 48. So it depends which plan you're talking about. He has done Vancouver twice, 20 years apart.
Well, my understanding was that the concentric ring model, which was superimposed over the city, starting with the central business district, which was the edge of the peninsula, that then went outwards and created the zone eventually, which was the industrial zone going from Falls Creek and around to Burrard Inlet. But of course, that works fine on the prairies and flatlands, but not particularly well if you've got an irregular shaped coastline.
No, I think you're right. I think the basic impact of Bartholomew was not that. It was really the grid system of the roads, because what we today call Vancouver, half of it was not developed. You know, when I came here, it was bush from about 41st on up. So there was a great deal of undeveloped, uncharted land, which ultimately was used in the 50 to roughly 68 period. And it was city land, because a great deal of the actual land had reverted to City Hall for taxes in the hungry 30s. So the big impact of Bartholomew was the grid system, which simply allowed the land which the city had inherited because of tax default to be retailed. And that happened in the 50s and early 60s.
Now, earlier on, that would have coincided with the layout of the old streetcar system.
Right. In fact, Bartholomew built on it, no question about it, sure. I still use the streetcar, so I know something about it. And the interurban, by the way, to New Westminster, which is another major transportation link.
Somewhere there's, Dad had some old footage of just someone got on the back of one of the streetcars with a moving camera and
Really?
just shot endlessly.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Be fascinating. What year would that be?
Well, it was still largely bush, so I would have thought, well, if not in the 30s,
And
thereabouts. I'm not sure. It could have even been in the late 20s.
really? Well,
Well, it was what,
fascinating.
28 was when Carrisdale amalgamated with the city, so there was
Yes,
a big...
yeah.
Mhm.
And Point Grey, yeah.
So it was into an evolving city that your relationship with Dad first came into being.
And teaching what I now call planning at the university level, which was not exactly a straightforward line. UBC was the first in Canada to actually teach planning at a university level, and certainly at what I would call postgraduate level. So Walter was very important to us and to me, and we to each other ultimately, in fostering an academic and ultimately professional framework of education at UBC.
What were the hot spots at that time in the mid-60s that you first started to examine in the city's development?
Well, I think the first really was the transformation of the West End, an extraordinary transformation. In other words, what happened, as you know, is new wine into old bottles. These old lots at the West End it was a very fine residential area, which suddenly was transformed into a much higher density, multiple housing unit, and that was an all-consuming process. What was interesting that almost at the same time, or a little later, the same thing was proposed for Shaughnessy, which is sometimes forgotten, because that was clearly another old residential area which had deteriorated to some degree because during the war, Shaughnessy particularly was a favorite boarding house area. I don't know whether you've checked into that, but a great number of the now fancy houses, which have been modeled and remodeled, were actually boarding and rooming houses between 1940 and 48. In fact, the old debate about illegal suites, which is still with us, all started in Shaughnessy. So that was part of the dynamics, the transformation of the old residential areas, the West End to start with, then the possibility, which fortunately did not happen, of Shaughnessy, and in between, of course, the false Fairview slopes. The change there from single-family residential area into a much more dense area, but it did not go all the way to the West End model. So the dynamics of that transformation of that inner ring of residential area was fascinating to us and to my students. In other words, my interest was really to teach by example, and from the very beginning our students went out and actually attempted to A, understand, and B, solve real urban situations. So our students were all over Falls Creek and the Fairview slopes and the West End, and trying to understand how these changes would affect the character and nature of the city.
Well, the West End was an interesting combination of the large parcels of land that had large houses on it that could be consolidated for high-rise development, coupled with the old streetcar lines. It was quite well defined as a neighborhood. You didn't have to go further than Davie to Denman down to be able to have the kind of commercial development on the streets, and then behind it the increasingly dense residential high-rise development.
Yes, the big question really was the street system, because as I said, it turned out to be new wine into old bottles. The street system was never designed for what it now has to carry, and the result is, you know, all these traffic stoppers and traffic delay bumpers and circles and so on introduced to discourage through traffic. But historically, and we debated that, and I think your father was part of it with Sutton Broad at the time, actually try and change the grid system by closing certain streets and putting into motion a kind of system of access, which is different from circulation. And that didn't happen because we still have, basically the old grid system of lots constraining the rational development. Yes, you're right. Some were able to assemble larger components, but many did not. So the road system was the one that we particularly wanted to change.
In contrast with the other major Western North American cities developing, particularly Los Angeles, but also Seattle on a much smaller scale, the development of the freeways and the emphasis on automobile culture was a major impact on the thinking of planners at that time. And yet you were looking in the West End at densification around an old grid system and an old streetcar route. Was that the thinking with Gerald Sutton Brown and others at the time, that Vancouver should adapt itself to the automobile culture in similar form to the American cities?
The quick answer is yes. It wasn't so much a question of adaptation, but taking advantage of certain both political, social trends and financial support. See, this is the time when we built the Trans-Canada Highway system. And the question is, what will happen when it comes to Vancouver? How will it serve us? How can you accommodate the impact on the city? And how will it go on, in theory at least, from here across to Victoria? So just like the US national highway system, which really transformed the US radically in the 50s, we were about to receive the Trans-Canada Highway. So the big question really was how to deal with the Trans-Canada once it hits our boundary. We couldn't know much about beyond that. So the question was what to do and how to make it come in and disgorge the great traffic. And of course we argued that we didn't really need it. The disastrous model of the impact of what would happen was all before us in Seattle and of course in LA, but you must connect that to the Trans-Canada Highway and the potential impact it had on the street system.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you discovered or unearthed this plan to bring the freeway in through what is now Gastown and downtown Eastside?
It wasn't that difficult because the Planning Commission discussed this.
That you were sitting on.
That's right, yeah, very much so. And it also was, in a sense, public knowledge. I don't mean the whole scheme, such as it was, perhaps, but the immediate resolution of certain things. The Venerable corridor, became a big issue. In fact, it was bits and pieces rather than the total scheme. And we tried to prevent certain things from happening, but Sutton Brown was convinced that he had the right solution, and he relied entirely on US engineering advice. And that's really where it all started. The engineers whom he brought in varying ways, following Bartholomew, I mean, this whole tradition of US consulting advice came from LA and from the freeway system, which was then full steam, and ultimately the model that consumes Seattle. So the question was, how can we become like them and therefore deal with the opportunities that this presented, and also the bringing Vancouver into the 20th century, that kind of idea.
Were you present at the so-called Great Freeway Debate at City?
Oh God, yes, I certainly was. I was chairman of the Planning Commission. In fact, if you go back to the archives, you can see me in glorious Technicolor. No, it was very simple because in those days, the Commission really had a role to play in various specific City Hall decisions, bylaws, and their acceptance or their defeat at City Hall. And we tried very hard to advise City Council as an independent unit, really, that the impact of the freeway system would be quite disastrous. But it was very difficult because A. Sutton Brown had this whole engineering machinery behind him, and City Hall bureaucracy was very strong and had a tremendous influence on City Council. You know, Mayor Campbell, if you remember that name, Tom, you know, was out there very much in support of the freeway and boosterism. That's what it was. I mean, there was an extraordinary opportunity of making Canada and making British Columbia and making Vancouver kind of part of the North American culture. The Planning Commission was not at all unanimous, so we debated this at great length, and ultimately, I don't know whether you remember that, but it's certainly part of the record, it came to a public hearing at John Oliver High School, at which I presented the Commission's view and then resigned publicly, and that really set the process in motion. It was after that that all the political machinery came to bear upon that decision. And Walter was there, of course, and everybody else. Out of that came a team. Without that, it probably wouldn't have started right at that moment anyway.
Obviously, Sutton Brown and Tom Campbell, and coming out of the age of W.A.C. Bennett, had a